George Orwell. Such were the joys. Such were the joys is a long autobiographical essay by the English writer George Orwell. In the piece, Orwell describes his experiences between the ages of 8 and 13, in the years before and during World War I, from September 1911 to December 1916. While a pupil at a preparatory school, St. Cyprian's, in the seaside town of Eastbourne, in Sussex, the essay offers various reflections on the contradictions of the Edwardian middle and upper-class worldview, on the psychology of children, and on the experience of oppression and class conflict. It was probably drafted in 1939-40, revised in 1945-46, and not completed until May or June 1948. It was first published by Partisan Review in 1952, 2 years after Orwell's death. The veracity of the stories it contains about life at St. Cyprian's has been challenged by a number of commenters, including Orwell's contemporaries at the school and biographers. But its powerful writing and haunting observations have made it one of Orwell's most commonly anthologized essays. Summary and analysis. The title of the essay is taken from The Echoing Green, one of William Blake's songs of innocence which Orwell's mother had read to him when they lived at Henley. The allusion is never explained in Orwell's text, but it is grimly ironic. Since Orwell recollects his early boarding school experiences with unvarnished realism, St. Cyprian's was, according to him, a world of force and fraud and secrecy, in which the young Orwell, a shy, sickly and unattractive boy surrounded by pupils from families much richer than his own, was like a goldfish thrown into a tank full of bike. The piece fiercely attacks the cruelty and snobbery of both his fellow pupils and of most of the adults connected with the school, particularly the headmaster, Mr. Vaughan Wilkes, nicknamed Sambo, and his wife Cicely, nicknamed Flip. Orwell describes the education he received as a preparation for a sort of confidence trick, geared entirely towards maximizing his future performance in the admissions exams to leading English public schools such as Eton and Harrow, without any concern for actual knowledge or understanding. He describes the approach as amounting to being cynically crammed, as a goose is crammed for Christmas. The process is exemplified by the date-learning teaching of history in which boys were encouraged to learn dates, without any understanding of the mysterious events they were naming. 1587, Massacre of St. Bartholomew. Treaty of Utrecht 1520. Field of the Cloth of Gold, and so on. Orwell also claims that he was accepted as a boarder at St. Cyprian's, at half of the usual fees, so that he might earn a scholarship that would look good in the school's publicity, and that his training relied heavily on the use of beatings, while the rich boys received preferential treatment and were exempted from corporal punishment. The essay lashes out at the hypocrisy of the Edwardian society in which Orwell grew up and in which a boy was bidden to be at once a Christian and a social success, which is impossible. A chapter is devoted to the puritanical attitudes towards sex at the time and to the frightful consequences of the discovery of what appears to have been a case of masturbation among a group of boys at the school. On the other hand, Orwell describes the actual pattern of school life as a continuous triumph of the strong over the weak. Virtue consisted in winning, it consisted in being bigger, stronger, handsome, richer, more popular, more elegant, more unscrupulous than other people, in dominating them, bullying them, making them suffer pain, making them look foolish, getting the better of them in every way. Life was hierarchical and whatever happened was right. There were the strong, who deserved to win and always did win, and there were the weak, who deserved to lose and always did lose, everlastingly. Orwell's story is punctuated by anecdotes about the dirt and squalor surrounding him, such as the porridge at the dining hall containing more lumps, hairs and unexplained black things than one would have thought possible, unless someone were putting them there on purpose, a human turd floating in the Devonshire baths, and a new boy's teeth turning green because of neglect. According to the essay, the main lesson that Orwell took away from St. Cyprian's was that, for a weak and inferior person such as himself, to survive, or at least to preserve any kind of independence, was essentially criminal, since it meant breaking rules which you yourself recognized, and that he lived in a world where it was not possible for him to be good. In the piece, Orwell also seeks to illustrate the reflection that children live in a sort of alien underwater world which we can only penetrate by memory or divination, and he wonders whether even in more modern times, without God, Latin, the cane, class distinctions and sexual taboos, it might still be normal for school children to live for years amid irrational terrors and lunatic misunderstandings. End of the summary. Let's listen to the complete essay. Section 1. Soon after I arrived at St. Cyprian's, not immediately, but after a week or two, just when I seemed to be settling into the routine of school life, I began wetting my bed. I was now aged 8, so that this was a reversion to a habit which I must have grown out of at least 4 years earlier. Nowadays, I believe, bedwetting in such circumstances is taken for granted. It is normal reaction in children who have been removed from their homes to a strange place. In those days, however, it was looked on as a disgusting crime which the child committed on purpose and for which the proper cure was a beating. For my part, I did not need to be told it was a crime. Night after night I prayed, with a fervor never previously attained in my prayers. Please God, do not let me wet my bed. Oh, please God, do not let me wet my bed. But it made remarkably little difference. Some nights the thing happened, others not. There was no volition about it, no consciousness. You did not, properly speaking, do the deed, you merely woke up in the morning and found that the sheets were wringing wet. After the second or third offense I was warned that I should be beaten next time, but I received the warning in a curiously roundabout way. One afternoon, as we were filing out from tea, Mrs. Wilkes, the headmaster's wife, was sitting at the head of one of the tables, chatting with a lady of whom I knew nothing, except that she was on an afternoon's visit to the school. She was an intimidating, masculine-looking person wearing a riding habit, or something that I took to be a riding habit. I was just leaving the room when Mrs. Wilkes called me back, as though to introduce me to the visitor. Mrs. Wilkes was nicknamed Flip, and I shall call her by that name, for I seldom think of her by any other. Officially, however, she was addressed as Mum, probably a corruption of the Mom used by public school boys to their housemasters' wives. She was a stocky, square-built woman with hard red cheeks, a flat top to her head, prominent brows and deep-set, suspicious eyes. Although a great deal of the time she was full of false heartiness, jollying one along with mannish slang, buck up, old chap, and so forth, and even using one's Christian name. Her eyes never lost their anxious, accusing look. It was very difficult to look her in the face without feeling guilty, even at moments when one was not guilty of anything in particular. "Here is a little boy," said Flip, indicating me to the strange lady, "who wets his bed every night. Do you know what I am going to do if you wet your bed again?" She added, turning to me, "I am going to get the sixth form to beat you." The strange lady put on an air of being inexpressibly shocked, and exclaimed, "I should think so." And here there occurred one of those wild, almost lunatic misunderstandings which are part of the daily experience of childhood. The sixth form was a group of older boys who were selected as having character and were empowered to beat smaller boys. I had not yet learned of their existence, and I misheard the phrase "the sixth form" as Mrs. Form. I took it as referring to the strange lady. I thought, that is, that her name was Mrs. Form. It was an improbable name, but a child has no judgment in such matters. I imagined, therefore, that it was she who was to be deputed to beat me. It did not strike me as strange that this job should be turned over to a casual visitor in no way connected with the school. I merely assumed the Mrs. Form was a stern disciplinarian who enjoyed beating people. Somehow her appearance seemed to bear this out, and I had an immediate terrifying vision of her arriving for the occasion in full riding kit and armed with a hunting whip. To this day I can feel myself almost swooning with shame as I stood, a very small, round-faced boy in short corduroy knickers, before the two women. I could not speak. I felt that I should die if Mrs. Form were to beat me. But my dominant feeling was not fear or even resentment, it was simply shame because one more person, and that a woman, had been told of my disgusting offense. A little later, I forget how, I learned that it was not after all Mrs. Form who would do the beating. I cannot remember whether it was that very night that I wetted my bed again, but at any rate I did wet it again quite soon. Oh, the despair, the feeling of cruel injustice, after all my prayers and resolutions, at once again waking between the clammy sheets. There was no chance of hiding what I had done. The grim statuesque matron, Margaret by name, arrived in the dormitory specially to inspect my bed. She pulled back the clothes, then drew herself up, and the dreaded words seemed to come rolling out of her like a peal of thunder. "Report yourself to the headmaster after breakfast." I put "report yourself" in capitals because that was how it appeared in my mind. I do not know how many times I heard that phrase during my early years at St. Cyprian's. It was only very rarely that it did not mean a beating. The words always had a portentous sound in my ears, like muffled drums or the words of the death sentence. When I arrived to report myself, Flip was doing something or other at the long shiny table in the anteroom to the study. Her uneasy eyes searched me as I went past. Sambo was a round-shouldered, curiously offish-looking man, not large but shambling in gait, with a chubby face which was like that of an overgrown baby, and which was capable of good humor. He knew, of course, why I had been sent to him, and had already taken a bone-handled riding crop out of the cupboard, but it was part of the punishment of reporting yourself that you had to proclaim your offense with your own lips. When I had said my say, he read me a short but pompous lecture, then seized me by the scruff of the neck, twisted me over and began beating me with the riding crop. He had a habit of continuing his lecture while he flogged you. And I remember the words "you dear little boy," keeping time with the blows. The beating did not hurt, perhaps, as it was the first time, he was not hitting me very hard, and I walked out feeling very much better. The fact that the beating had not hurt was a sort of victory and partially wiped out the shame of the bedwetting. I was even incautious enough to wear a grin on my face. Some small boys were hanging about in the passage outside the door of the anteroom. "Do you get the cane?" "It didn't hurt," I said proudly. Flip had heard everything. Instantly her voice came screaming after me. "Come here. Come here this instant. What was that you said?" I said it didn't hurt, I faltered out. "How dare you say a thing like that? Do you think that is a proper thing to say? Go in and report yourself again." This time Sambo laid on in real earnest. He continued for a length of time that frightened and astonished me, about 5 minutes, it seemed, ending up by breaking the riding crop. The bone handle went flying across the room. "Look what you've made me do," he said furiously, holding the broken crop. I had fallen into a chair, weakly snivelling. I remember that this was the only time throughout my boyhood when a beating actually reduced me to tears, and curiously enough I was not even now crying because of the pain. The second beating had not hurt very much either. Fright and shame seemed to have anesthetized me. I was crying partly because I felt that this was expected of me, partly from genuine repentance, but partly also because of a deeper grief which is peculiar to childhood and not easy to convey, a sense of desolate loneliness and helplessness. Of being locked up not only in a hostile world but in a world of good and evil where the rules were such that it was actually not possible for me to keep them. I knew the bedwetting was, A, wicked and, B, outside my control. The second fact I was personally aware of, and the first I did not question. It was possible, therefore, to commit a sin without knowing that you committed it. Without wanting to commit it, and without being able to avoid it. Sin was not necessarily something that you did, it might be something that happened to you. I do not want to claim that this idea flashed into my mind as a complete novelty at this very moment. Under the blows of Sambo's cane, I must have had glimpses of it even before I left home, for my early childhood had not been altogether happy. But at any rate this was the great, abiding lesson of my boyhood. That I was in a world where it was not possible for me to be good. And the double beating was a turning point, for it brought home to me for the first time the harshness of the environment into which I had been flung. Life was more terrible, and I was more wicked, than I had imagined. At any rate, as I sat snivelling on the edge of a chair in Sambo's study, with not even the self-possession to stand up while he stormed at me, I had a conviction of sin and folly and weakness, such as I do not remember to have felt before. In general, one's memories of any period must necessarily weaken as one moves away from it. One is constantly learning new facts, and old ones have to drop out to make way for them. At 20 I could have written the history of my school days with an accuracy which would be quite impossible now. But it can also happen that one's memories grow sharper after a long lapse of time. Because one is looking at the past with fresh eyes and can isolate and, as it were, notice facts which previously existed undifferentiated among a mass of others. Here are two things which in a sense I remembered, but which did not strike me as strange or interesting until quite recently. One is that the second beating seemed to me a just and reasonable punishment. To get one beating, and then to get another and far fiercer one on top of it, for being so unwise as to show that the first had not hurt, that was quite natural. The gods are jealous, and when you have good fortune you should conceal it. The other is that I accepted the broken riding crop as my own crime. I can still recall my feeling as I saw the handle lying on the carpet, the feeling of having done an ill-bred clumsy thing, and ruined an expensive object. I had broken it, so Sambo told me, and so I believed. This acceptance of guilt lay unnoticed in my memory for 20 or 30 years. So much for the episode of the bedwetting. But there is one more thing to be remarked. This is that I did not wet my bed again, at least, I did wet it once again, and received another beating, after which the trouble stopped. So perhaps this barbarous remedy does work, though at a heavy price, I have no doubt. Section 2. St. Cyprian's was an expensive and snobbish school which was in process of becoming more snobbish, and, I imagine, more expensive. The public school with which it had special connections was Harrow, but during my time an increasing proportion of the boys went on to Eton. Most of them were the children of rich parents. But on the whole they were the aristocratic rich, the sort of people who live in huge shrubberied houses in Bournemouth or Richmond, and who have cars and butlers but not country estates. There were a few exotics among them, some South American boys, sons of Argentine beef barons, one or two Russians, and even a Siamese prince, or someone who was described as a prince. Sambo had two great ambitions. One was to attract titled boys to the school, and the other was to train up pupils to win scholarships at public schools, above all at Eton. He did, towards the end of my time, succeed in getting hold of two boys with real English titles. One of them, I remember, was a wretched drivelling little creature, almost an albino, peering upwards out of weak eyes, with a long nose at the end of which a dewdrop always seemed to be trembling. Sambo always gave these boys their titles when mentioning them to a third person, and for their first few days he actually addressed them to their faces as Lord So-and-so. Needless to say he found ways of drawing attention to them when any visitor was being shown round the school. Once, I remember, the little fair-haired boy had a choking fit at dinner, and a stream of snot ran out of his nose onto his plate in a way horrible to see. Any lesser person would have been called a dirty little beast and ordered out of the room instantly. But Sambo and Flip laughed it off in a boys will be boys spirit. All the very rich boys were more or less undisguisedly favoured. The school still had a faint suggestion of the Victorian private academy with its parlour boarders, and when I later read about that kind of school in Thackeray I immediately saw the resemblance. The rich boys had milk and biscuits in the middle of the morning, they were given riding lessons once or twice a week, Flip mothered them and called them by their Christian names, and above all they were never caned. Apart from the South Americans, whose parents were safely distant. I doubt whether Sambo ever caned any boy whose father's income was much above £2,000 a year. But he was sometimes willing to sacrifice financial profit to scholastic prestige. Occasionally, by special arrangement. He would take at greatly reduced fees some boy who seemed likely to win scholarships and thus bring credit on the school. It was on these terms that I was at St. Cyprian's myself, otherwise my parents could not have afforded to send me to so expensive a school. I did not at first understand that I was being taken at reduced fees. It was only when I was about 11 that Flip and Sambo began throwing the fact in my teeth. For my first 2 or 3 years I went through the ordinary educational mill, then, soon after I had stated Greek, 1 started Latin at 8, Greek at 10, I moved into the scholarship class, which was taught, so far as classics went, largely by Sambo himself. Over a period of 2 or 3 years the scholarship boys were crammed with learning as cynically as a goose is crammed for Christmas. And with what learning? This business of making a gifted boy's career depend on a competitive examination, taken when he is only 12 or 13, is an evil thing at best, but there do appear to be preparatory schools which send scholars to Eton, Winchester, etc. without teaching them to see everything in terms of marks. At St. Cyprian's the whole process was frankly a preparation for a sort of confidence trick. Your job was to learn exactly those things that would give an examiner the impression that you knew more than you did know, and as far as possible to avoid burdening your brain with anything else. Subjects which lacked examination value, such as geography, were almost completely neglected. Mathematics was also neglected if you were a classical. Science was not taught in any form, indeed it was so despised that even an interest in natural history was discouraged, and even the books you were encouraged to read in your spare time were chosen with one eye on the English paper. Latin and Greek, the main scholarship subjects, were what counted. But even these were deliberately taught in a flashy, unsound way. We never, for example, read right through even a single book of a Greek or Latin author. We merely read short passages which were picked out because they were the kind of thing likely to be set as an unseen translation. During the last year or so before we went up for our scholarships, most of our time was spent in simply working our way through the scholarship papers of previous years. Sambo had sheaves of these in his possession, from every one of the major public schools. But the greatest outrage of all was the teaching of history. There was in those days a piece of nonsense called the Harrow History Prize, an annual competition for which many preparatory schools entered. It was a tradition for St. Cyprian's to win it every year, as well we might. For we had mugged up every paper that had been set since the competition started, and the supply of possible questions was not inexhaustible. They were the kind of stupid question that is answered by rapping out a name of quotation. Who plundered the Begums? Who was beheaded in an open boat? Who caught the Whigs bathing and ran away with their clothes? Almost all our historical teaching ran on this level. History was a series of unrelated, unintelligible but, in some way that was never explained to us, important facts with resounding phrases tied to them. Disraeli brought peace with honor. Clive was astonished at his moderation. Pitt called in the New World to redress the balance of the Old. And the dates, and the mnemonic devices. Did you know, for example, that the initial letters of A Black Negress was my aunt, There's Her House Behind the Barn are also the initial letters of the battles in the Wars of the Roses? Flip, who took the higher forms in history, revelled in this kind of thing. I recall positive orgies of dates, with the keener boys leaping up and down in their places in their eagerness to shout out the right answers, and at the same time not feeling the faintest interest in the meaning of the mysterious events they were naming. 1587. Massacre of St. Bartholomew. 1707. Death of Aurangzeb. 1713. Treaty of Utrecht. 1773. Boston Tea Party. 1520. Ooh, Mum, please, Mum. Please, Mum, please, Mum. Let me tell him, Mum. Well. 1520. Field of the Cloth of Gold. And so on. But history and such secondary subjects were not bad fun. It was in classics that the real strain came. Looking back, I realized that I then worked harder than I have ever done since, and yet at the time it never seemed possible to make quite the effort that was demanded of one. We would sit round the long shiny table, made of some very pale-coloured hardwood, with Sambo goading, threatening, exhorting, sometimes joking, very occasionally praising, but always prodding away at one's mind to keep it up to the right pitch of concentration, as one keeps a sleepy person awake by sticking pins in him. Go on, you little slacker. Go on, you idle, worthless little boy. The whole trouble with you is that you're bone and horn idle. You eat too much, that's why. You wolf down enormous meals, and then when you come here you're half asleep. Go on, now, put your back into it. You're not thinking. Your brain doesn't sweat. He would tap away at one's skull with his silver pencil, which, in my memory, seems to have been about the size of a banana, and which certainly was heavy enough to raise a bump, or he would pull the short hairs round one's ears, or, occasionally, reach out under the table and kick one's shin. On some days nothing seemed to go right. And then it would be all right, then, I know what you want. You've been asking for it the whole morning. Come along, you useless little slacker. Come into the study. And then whack, 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 and back one would come, red-wheeled and smarting. In later years Sambo had abandoned his riding crop in favor of a thin rattan cane which hurt very much more, to settle down to work again. This did not happen very often, but I do remember, more than once, being led out of the room in the middle of a Latin sentence, receiving a beating and then going straight ahead with the same sentence, just like that. It is a mistake to think such methods do not work. They work very well for their special purpose. Indeed, I doubt whether classical education ever has been or can be successfully carried on without corporal punishment. The boys themselves believed in its efficacy. There was a boy named Beecham, with no brains to speak of, but evidently in acute need of a scholarship. Sambo was flogging him towards the goal as one might do with a foundered horse. He went up for a scholarship at Uppingham, came back with the consciousness of having done badly, and a day or two later received a severe beating for idleness. I wish I'd had that caning before I went up for the exam, he said sadly, a remark which I felt to be contemptible, but which I perfectly well understood. The boys of the scholarship class were not all treated alike. If a boy were the son of rich parents to whom the saving of fees was not all important, Sambo would goad him along in a comparatively fatherly way, with jokes and digs in the ribs and perhaps an occasional tap with the pencil, but no hair pulling and no caning. It was the poor but clever boys who suffered. Our brains were a gold mine in which he had sunk money, and the dividends must be squeezed out of us. Long before I had grasped the nature of my financial relationship with Sambo, I had been made to understand that I was not on the same footing as most of the other boys. In effect there were three castes in the school. There was the minority with an aristocratic or millionaire background, there were the children of the ordinary suburban rich, who made up the bulk of the school, and there were a few underlings like myself, the sons of clergymen, Indian civil servants, struggling widows and the like. These poorer ones were discouraged from going in for extras such as shooting and carpentry, and were humiliated over clothes and petty possessions. I never, for instance, succeeded in getting a cricket bat of my own, because your parents wouldn't be able to afford it. This phrase pursued me throughout my school days. At St. Cyprian's we were not allowed to keep the money we brought back with us, but had to give it in on the first day of term, and then from time to time were allowed to spend it under supervision. I and similarly placed boys were always choked off from buying expensive toys like model aeroplanes, even if the necessary money stood to our credit. Flip, in particular, seemed to aim consciously at inculcating a humble outlook in the poorer boys. Do you think that's the sort of thing a boy like you should buy? I remember her saying to somebody, and she said this in front of the whole school, you know you're not going to grow up with money, don't you? Your people aren't rich. You must learn to be sensible. Don't get above yourself. There was also the weekly pocket money, which we took out in sweets, dispensed by Flip from a large table. The millionaires had a sixpence a week, but the normal sum was threepence. I and one or two others were only allowed twopence. My parents had not given instructions to this effect, and the saving of a penny a week could not conceivably have made any difference to them, it was a mark of status. Worse yet was the detail of the birthday cakes. It was usual for each boy, on his birthday, to have a large iced cake with candles, which was shared out at tea between the whole school. It was provided as a matter of routine and went on his parents' bill. I never had such a cake, though my parents would have paid for it readily enough. Year after year, never daring to ask, I would miserably hope that his year a cake would appear. Once or twice I even rashly pretended to my companions that this time I was going to have a cake. Then came tea time, and no cake, which did not make me more popular. Very early it was impressed upon me that I had no chance of a decent future unless I won a scholarship at a public school. Either I won my scholarship, or I must leave school at 14 and become, in Sambo's favourite phrase, a little office boy at £40 a year. In my circumstances it was natural that I should believe this. Indeed, it was universally taken for granted at St. Cyprian's that unless you went to a good public school, and only about 15 schools came under this heading, you were ruined for life. It is not easy to convey to a grown-up person the sense of strain, of nerving oneself for some terrible, all-deciding combat, as the date of the examination crept nearer, 11 years old, 12 years old, then 13, the fatal year itself. Over a period of about 2 years, I do not think there was ever a day when the exam, as I called it, was quite out of my waking thoughts. In my prayers it figured invariably, and whenever I got the bigger portion of a wishbone, or picked up a horseshoe, or bowed 7 times to the new moon, or succeeded in passing through a wishing gate without touching the sides, then the wish I earned by doing so went on the exam as a matter of course. And yet curiously enough I was also tormented by an almost irresistible impulse not to work. There were days when my heart sickened at the labours ahead of me, and I stood stupid as an animal before the most elementary difficulties. In the holidays, also, I could not work. Some of the scholarship bonus received extra tuition from a certain Mr. Bachelor, a likeable, very hairy man who wore shaggy suits and lived in a typical bachelor's den, book-lined wall, overwhelming stench of tobacco, somewhere in the town. During the holidays Mr. Bachelor used to send us extracts from a wad of work once a week. Somehow I could not do it. The empty paper and the black Latin dictionary lying on the table. The consciousness of a plain duty shirked, poisoned my leisure, but somehow I could not start, and by the end of the holidays I would only have sent Mr. Bachelor 50 or 100 lines. Undoubtedly part of the reason was that Sambo and his cane were far away. But in term time, also, I would go through periods of idleness and stupidity when I would sink deeper and deeper into disgrace and even achieve a sort of feeble, snivelling defiance, fully conscious of my guilt and yet unable or unwilling, I could not be sure which, to do any better. Then Sambo or Flip would send for me, and this time it would not even be a caning. Flip would search me with her baleful eyes. What color were those eyes, I wonder? I remember them as green, but actually no human being has green eyes. Perhaps they were hazel. She would start off in her peculiar, wheedling, bullying style, which never failed to get right through one's guard and score a hit on one's better nature. I don't think it's awfully decent of you to behave like this, is it? Do you think it's quite playing the game by your mother and father to go on idling your time away, week after week, month after month? Do you want to throw all your chances away? You know your people aren't rich, don't you? You know they can't afford the same things as other boys' parents. How are they to send you to a public school if you don't win a scholarship? I know how proud your mother is of you. Do you want to let her down? I don't think he wants to go to a public school any longer. Sambo would say, addressing himself to Flip with a pretense that I was not there. I think he's given up that idea. He wants to be a little boy at £40 a year. The horrible sensation of tears, a swelling in the breast, a tickling behind the nose, would already have assailed me. Flip would bring out her race of trumps. And do you think it's quite fair to us, the way you're behaving? After all we've done for you? You do know what we've done for you, don't you? Her eyes would pierce deep into me, and though she never said it straight out, I did know. We've had you here all these years, we even had you here for a week in the holidays so that Mr. Batchelor could coach you. We don't want to have to send you away, you know. But we can't keep a boy here just to eat up our food, term after term. I don't think it's very straight, the way you're behaving. Do you? I never had any answer except a miserable no, Mum, or yes, Mum, as the case might be. Evidently it was not straight, the way I was behaving. And at some point or other the unwanted tear would always force its way out of the corner of my eye, roll down my nose and splash. Flip never said in plain words that I was a non-paying pupil, no doubt because vague phrases like "all we've done for you" had a deeper emotional appeal. Sambo, who did not aspire to be loved by his pupils, put it more brutally, though, as was usual with him in pompous language. "You are living on my bounty" was his favorite phrase in this context. At least once I listened to these words between blows of the cane. I must say that these scenes were not frequent, and except on one occasion they did not take place in the presence of other boys. In public I was reminded that I was poor and that my parents wouldn't be able to afford this or that, but I was not actually reminded of my dependent position. It was a final unanswerable argument, to be brought forth like an instrument of torture when my work became exceptionally bad. To grasp the effect of this kind of thing on a child of 10 or 12, one has to remember that the child has little sense of proportion or probability. A child may be a mass of egoism and rebelliousness, but it has no accumulated experience to give it confidence in its own judgments. On the whole it will accept what it is told, and it will believe in the most fantastic way in the knowledge and powers of the adults surrounding it. Here is an example. I have said that at St. Cyprian's we were not allowed to keep our own money. However, it was possible to hold back a shilling or two, and sometimes I used furtively to buy sweets which I kept hidden in the loose ivy on the playing field wall. One day when I had been sent on an errand I went into a sweet shop a mile or more from the school and bought some chocolates. As I came out of the shop I saw on the opposite pavement a small sharp-faced man who seemed to be staring very hard at my school cap. Instantly a horrible fear went through me. There could be no doubt as to who the man was. He was a spy placed there by Sambo. I turned away unconcernedly. And then, as though my legs were doing it of their own accord, broke into a clumsy run. But when I got round the next corner I forced myself to walk again. For to run was a sign of guilt, and obviously there would be other spies posted here and there about the town. All that day and the next I waited for the summons to the study, and was surprised when it did not come. It did not seem to me strange that the headmaster of a private school should dispose of an army of informers, and I did not even imagine that would have to pay them. I assumed that any adult, inside the school or outside, would collaborate voluntarily in preventing us from breaking the rules. Sambo was all-powerful, it was natural that his agent should be everywhere. When this episode happened I do not think I can have been less than 12 years old. I hated Sambo and Flip with a sort of shamefaced, remorseful hatred, but it did not occur to me to doubt their judgment. When they told me that I must either win a public school scholarship or become an office boy at 14, I believed that those were the unavoidable alternatives before me. And above all, I believed Sambo and Flip when they told me they were my benefactors. I see now, of course, that from Sambo's point of view I was a good speculation. He sank money in me, and he looked to get it back in the form of prestige. If I had gone off, as promising boys sometimes do, I imagine that would have got rid of me swiftly. As it was I won him scholarships when the time came, and no doubt he made full use of them in his prospectuses. But it is difficult for a child to realize that a school is primarily a commercial venture. A child believes that the school exists to educate and that the schoolmaster disciplines him either for his own good, or from a love of bullying. Flip and Sambo had chosen to befriend me, and their friendship included canings, reproaches and humiliations, which were good for me and saved me from an office stool. That was their version, and I believed in it. It was therefore clear that I owed them a vast debt of gratitude. But I was not grateful, as I very well knew. On the contrary, I hated both of them. I could not control my subjective feelings, and I could not conceal them from myself. But it is wicked, is it not, to hate your benefactors? So I was taught, and so I believed. A child accepts the codes of behavior that are presented to it, even when it breaks them. From the age of 8 or even earlier, the consciousness of sin was never far away from me. If I contrived to seem callous and defiant, it was only a thin cover over a mass of shame and dismay. All through my boyhood I had a profound conviction that I was no good, that was wasting my time, wrecking my talents, behaving with monstrous folly and wickedness and ingratitude, and all this, it seemed, was inescapable, because I lived among laws which were absolute, like the law of gravity, but which it was not possible for me to keep. Section 3. No one can look back on his school days and say with truth that they were altogether unhappy. I have good memories of St. Cyprian's, among a horde of bad ones. Sometimes on summer afternoons there were wonderful expeditions across the downs to a village called Burling Gap, or to Beachy Head, where one bathed dangerously among the boulders and came home covered with cuts. And there were still more wonderful midsummer evenings when, as a special treat, we were not driven off to bed as usual but allowed to wander about the grounds in the long twilight, ending up with a plunge into the swimming bathe at about 9 o'clock. There was the joy of waking early on summer mornings and getting in an hour's undisturbed reading. Ian Hay, Thackeray, Kipling and H.G. Wells were the favourite authors of my boyhood, in the sunlit, sleeping dormitory. There was also cricket, which I was no good at but with which I conducted a sort of helpless love affair up to the age of about 18. And there was the pleasure of keeping caterpillars, the silky green and purple puss moth, the ghostly green poplar hawk, the privet hawk. Large as one's third finger, specimens of which could be illicitly purchased for sixpence at a shop in the town, and, when one could escape long enough from the master who was taking the walk, there was the excitement of dredging the dew ponds on the downs for enormous newts with orange-coloured bellies. This business of being out for a walk, coming across something of fascinating interest and then being dragged away from it by a yell from the master, like a dog jerked onwards by the leash, is an important feature of school life, and helps to build up the conviction, so strong in many children, that the things you most want to do are always unattainable. Very occasionally, perhaps once during each summer, it was possible to escape altogether from the barrack-like atmosphere of school, when Brown, the second master, was permitted to take 1 or 2 boys for an afternoon of butterfly hunting on a common a few miles away. Brown was a man with white hair and a red face like a strawberry, who was good at natural history, making models and plaster casts, operating magic lanterns, and things of that kind. He and Mr. Batchelor were the only adults in any way connected with the school whom I did not either dislike or fear. Once he took me into his room and showed me in confidence a plated, pearl-handled revolver, his 6-shooter, he called it, which he kept in a box under his bed, and oh, the joy of those occasional expeditions. The ride of 2 or 3 miles on a lonely little branch line, the afternoon of charging to and fro with large green nets, the beauty of the enormous dragonflies which hovered over the tops of the grasses. The sinister killing bottle with its sickly smell, and then tea in the parlour of a pub with large slices of pale-coloured cake. The essence of it was in the railway journey, which seemed to put magic distances between yourself and school. Flip characteristically disapproved of these expeditions, though not actually forbidding them. "And have you been catching little butterflies?" she would say with a vicious sneer when one got back, making her voice as babyish as possible. From her point of view, natural history, bug hunting she would probably have called it, was a babyish pursuit which a boy should be laughed out of as early as possible. Moreover, it was somehow faintly plebeian. It was traditionally associated with boys who wore spectacles and were no good at games. It did not help you to pass exams, and above all it smelt of science and therefore seemed to menace classical education. It needed a considerable moral effort to accept Brown's invitation. How I dreaded that sneer of little butterflies. Brown, however, who had been at the school since its early days, had built up a certain independence for himself. He seemed to handle Sambo, and ignored Flip a good deal. If it ever happened that both of them were away, Brown acted as deputy headmaster, and on those occasions instead of reading the appointed lesson for the day at morning chapel, he would read us stories from the Apocrypha. Most of the good memories of my childhood, and up to the age of about 20, are in some way connected with animals. So far as St. Cyprian's goes, it also seems, when I look back, that all my good memories are of summer. In winter your nose ran continually, your fingers were too numb to button your shirt. This was an especial misery on Sundays, when we wore Eton collars. There was the daily nightmare of football, the cold, the mud, the hideous greasy ball that came whizzing at one's face, the gouging knees and trampling boots of the bigger boys. Part of the trouble was that in winter, after about the age of 10, I was seldom in good health, at any rate during term time. I had defective bronchial tubes and a lesion in one lung which was not discovered till many years later. Hence I not only had a chronic cough, but running was a torment to me. In those days however, wheeziness, or chestiness, as it was called, was either diagnosis imagination or was looked on as essentially a moral disorder, caused by overeating. "You wheeze like a concertina," Sambo would say disapprovingly as he stood behind my chair, "you are perpetually stuffing yourself with food, that's why." My cough was referred to as a stomach cough, which made it sound both disgusting and reprehensible. The cure for it was hard running, which, if you kept it up long enough, ultimately cleared your chest. It is curious, the degree, I will not say of actual hardship, but of squalor and neglect, that was taken for granted in upper-class schools of the period. Almost as in the days of Thackeray, it seemed natural that a little boy of 8 or 10 should be a miserable, sooty-nosed creature, his face almost permanently dirty, his hands chapped, his nails bitten, his handkerchief a sodden horror, his bottom frequently blue with bruises. It was partly the prospect of actual physical discomfort that made the thought of going back to school lie in one's breast like a lump of lead during the last few days of the holidays. A characteristic memory of St. Cyprian's is the astonishing hardness of one's bed on the first night of term. Since this was an expensive school, I took a social step upwards by attending it, and yet the standard of comfort was in every way far lower than in my own home, or, indeed, than it would have been in a prosperous working-class home. One only had a hot bath once a week, for instance. The food was not only bad, it was also insufficient. Never before or since have I seen butter of jam scraped on bread so thinly. I so not think I can be imagining the fact that we were underfed, when I remember the lengths we would go in order to steal food. On a number of occasions I remember creeping down at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning through what seemed like miles of pitch-dark stairways and passages, barefooted, stopping to listen after each step, paralyzed with about equal fear of Sambo, ghosts and burglars, to steal stale bread from the pantry. The assistant masters had their meals with us, but they had somewhat better food, and if one got half a chance it was usual to steal leftover scraps of bacon rind or fried potato when their plates were removed. As usual, I did not see the sound commercial reason for this underfeeding. On the whole I accepted Sambo's view that a boy's appetite is a sort of morbid growth which should be kept in check as much as possible. A maxim often repeated to us at St. Cyprian's was that it is healthy to get up from a meal feeling as hungry as when you sat down. Only a generation earlier than this it had been common for school dinners to start off with a slab of unsweetened suet pudding, which, it was frankly said, broke the boys' appetites. But the underfeeding was probably less flagrant at preparatory schools, where a boy was wholly dependent on the official diet, than at public schools, where he was allowed, indeed, expected, to buy extra food for himself. At some schools, he would literally not have had enough to eat unless he had bought regular supplies of eggs, sausages, sardines, etc., and his parents had to allow him money for this purpose. At Eton, for instance, at any rate in college, a boy was given no solid meal after midday dinner. For his afternoon tea he was given a miserable supper of soup or fried fish, or more often bread and cheese, with water to drink. Sambo went down to see his eldest son at Eton and came back in snobbish ecstasies over the luxury in which the boys lived. They give them fried fish for supper. he exclaimed, beaming all over his chubby face. "There's no school like it in the world. Fried fish. The habitual supper of the poorest of the working class. At very cheap boarding schools it was no doubt worse. A very early memory to mine is of seeing the boarders at a grammar school, the sons, probably, of farmers and shopkeepers, being fed on boiled lights. Whoever writes about his childhood must beware of exaggeration and self-pity. I do not claim that I was a martyr or that St. Cyprian's was a sort of do-the-boys' hall. But I should be falsifying my own memories if I did not record that they are largely memories of disgust. The overcrowded, underfed, underwashed life that we led was disgusting, as I recall it. If I shut my eyes and say school, it is of course the physical surroundings that first come back to me, the flat playing field with its cricket pavilion and the little shed by the rifle range, the draughty dormitories, the dusty splintery passages, the square of asphalt in front of the gymnasium, the raw-looking pine-wood chaplet at the back. And at almost every point some filthy detail obtrudes itself. For example, there were the pewter bowls out of which we had our porridge. They had overhanging rims, and under the rims there were accumulations of sour porridge, which could be flaked off in ling strips. The porridge itself, too, contained more lumps, hairs and unexplained black things than one would have thought possible, unless someone were putting them there on purpose. It was never safe to start on that porridge without investigating it first. And there was the slimy water of the plunge bath. It was 12 or 15 feet long. The whole school was supposed to go into it every morning, and I doubt whether the water was changed at all frequently, and the always damp towels with their cheesy smell, and, on occasional visits in the winter, the murky sea water of the local baths, which came straight in from the beach and on which I once saw floating a human turd. And the sweaty smell of the changing room with its greasy basins, and, giving on this, the row of filthy, dilapidated lavatories, which had no fastenings of any kind on the doors, so that whenever you were sitting there someone was sure to come crashing in. It is not easy for me to think of my school days without seeming to breathe in a whiff of something cold and evil-smelling, a sort of compound of sweaty stockings, dirty towels, fecal smells blowing along corridors, forks with old food between the prongs, neck of mutton stew, and the banging doors of the lavatories and the echoing chamber pots in the dormitories. It is true that I am by nature not gregarious, and the WC and dirty handkerchief side of life is necessarily more obtrusive when great numbers of human beings are crushed together in a small space. It is just as bad in an army, and worse, no doubt, in a prison. Besides, boyhood is the age of disgust. After one has learned to differentiate, and before one has become hardened, between 7 and 18, say, one seems always to be walking the tightrope over a cesspool. Yet I do not think I exaggerate the squalor of school life, when I remember how health and cleanliness were neglected, in spite of the hoo-ha about fresh air and cold water and keeping in hard training. It was common to remain constipated for days together. Indeed, one was hardly encouraged to keep one's bowels open, since the only aperients tolerated were castor oil or another almost equally horrible drink called licorice powder. One was supposed to go into the plunge bath every morning, but some boys shirked it for days on end, simply making themselves scarce when the bell sounded, or else slipping along the edge of the bath among the crowd, and then wetting their hair with a little dirty water off the floor. A little boy of 8 or 9 will not necessarily keep himself clean unless there is someone to see that he does it. There was a new boy named Hazel. A pretty, mother's darling of a boy, who came a little while before I left. The first thing I noticed about him was the beautiful pearly whiteness of his teeth. By the end of that term his teeth were an extraordinary shade of green. During all that time, apparently, no one had taken sufficient interest in him to see that he brushed them. But of course the differences between home and school were more than physical. That bump on the hard mattress, on the first night of term, used to give me a feeling of abrupt awakening, a feeling of, this is reality, this is what you are up against. Your home might be far from perfect, but at least it was a place ruled by love rather than by fear, where you did not have to be perpetually on your guard against the people surrounding you. At 8 years old you were suddenly taken out of this warm nest and flung into a world of force and fraud and secrecy, like a goldfish into a tank full of bike. Against no matter what degree of bullying you had no redress. You could only have defended yourself by sneaking, which, except in a few rigidly defined circumstances, was the unforgivable sin. To write home and ask your parent to take you away would have been even less thinkable, since to do so would have been to admit yourself unhappy and unpopular, which a boy will never do. Boys are Erewhonians. They think that misfortune is disgraceful and must be concealed to all cost. It might perhaps have been considered permissible to complain to your parents about bad food, or an unjustified caning, or some other ill treatment inflicted by masters and not by boys. The fact that Sambo never beat the richer boys suggests that such complaints were made occasionally. But in my own peculiar circumstances I could never have asked my parents to intervene on my behalf. Even before I understood about the reduced fees, I grasped that they were in some way under an obligation to Sambo, and therefore could not protect me against him. I have mentioned already that throughout my time at St. Cyprian's I never had a cricket bat of my own. I had been told this was because your parents couldn't afford it. One day in the holidays, by some casual remark, it came out that they had provided 10 shillings to buy me one, yet no cricket bat appeared. I did not protest to my parents, let alone raise the subject with Sambo. How could I? I was dependent on him, and the 10 shillings was merely a fragment of what I owed him. I realize now, of course, that it is immensely unlikely that Sambo had simply stuck to the money. No doubt the matter had slipped his memory. But the point is that I assumed that he had stuck to it, and that he had a right to do so if he chose. How difficult it is for a child to have any real independence of attitude could be seen in our behavior towards Flip. I think it would be true to say that every boy in the school hated and feared her. Yet we all fawned on her in the most abject way, and the top layer of our feelings towards her was a sort of guilt-stricken loyalty. Flip, although the discipline of the school depended more on her than on Sambo, hardly pretended to dispense strict justice. She was frankly capricious. An act which might get you a caning one day might next day be laughed off as a boyish prank, or even commended because it showed you had guts. There were days when everyone cowered before those deep-set, accusing eyes, and there were days when she was like a flirtatious queen surrounded by courtier lovers, laughing and joking, scattering largesse, or the promise of largesse. And if you win the Harrow History Prize I'll give you a new case for your camera, and occasionally even packing 3 or 4 favored boys into her Ford car and carrying them off to a tea shop in town, where they were allowed to buy coffee and cakes. Flip was inextricably mixed up in my mind with Queen Elizabeth, whose relations with Leicester and Essex and Raleigh were intelligible to me from a very early age. A word we all constantly used in speaking of Flip was favour. I'm in good favour, we would say, or I'm in bad favour. Except for the handful of wealthy or titled boys, no one was permanently in good favour, but on the other hand even the outcasts had patches of it from time to time. Thus, although my memories of Flip are mostly hostile, I also remember considerable periods when I basked under her smiles, when she called me old chap and used my Christian name, and allowed me to frequent her private library, where I first made acquaintance with Vanity Fair. The high water mark of good favour was to be invited to serve at table on Sunday nights when Flip and Sambo had guests to dinner. In clearing away, of course, one had a chance to finish off the scraps, but one also got a servile pleasure from standing behind the seated guests and darting deferentially forward when something was wanted. Whenever one had the chance to suck up, one did suck up, and at the first smile one's hatred turned into a sort of cringing love. I was always tremendously proud when I succeeded in making Flip laugh. I have even, at her command, written verse d'occasion, comic verses to celebrate memorable events in the life of the school. I am anxious to make it clear that I was not a rebel, except by force of circumstances. I accepted the codes that I found in being. Once, towards the end of my time, I even sneaked to Brown about a suspected case of homosexuality. I did not know very well what homosexuality was, but I knew that it happened and was bad, and that this was one of the contexts in which it was proper to sneak. Brown told me I was a good fellow, which make me feel horribly ashamed. Before Flip one seemed as helpless as a snake before the snake charmer. She had a hardly varying vocabulary of praise and abuse, a whole series of set phrased, each of which promptly called forth the appropriate response. There was "buck up, old chap," which inspired one to paroxysms of energy. There was "don't be such a fool," or "it's pathetic, isn't it?" which made one feel a born idiot, and there was "it isn't very straight of you, is it?" which always brought one to the brink of tears. And yet all the while, at the middle of one's heart, there seemed to stand an incorruptible inner self who knew that whatever one did, whether one laughed or snivelled or went into frenzies of gratitude for small favours, one's only true feeling was hatred. Section 4. I had learned early in my career that one can do wrong against one's will, and before long I also learned that one can do wrong without ever discovering what one has done or why it was wrong. There were sins that were too subtle to be explained, and there were others that were too terrible to be clearly mentioned. For example, there was sex, which was always smouldering just under the surface and which suddenly blew up into a tremendous row when I was about 12. At some preparatory schools homosexuality is not a problem, but I think that St. Cyprian's may have acquired a bad tone thanks to the presence of the South American boys, who would perhaps mature a year or two earlier than an English boy. At that age I was not interested, so I not actually know what went on. But I imagine it was group masturbation. At any rate, one day the storm suddenly burst over our heads. There were summonses, interrogations, confessions, floggings, repentances, solemn lectures of which one understood nothing except that some irredeemable sin known as swinishness or beastliness had been committed. One of the ringleaders, a boy named Horn, was flogged, according to eyewitnesses, for a quarter of an hour continuously before being expelled. His yells rang through the house. But we were all implicated, more or less, or felt ourselves to be implicated. Guilt seemed to hang in the air like a pall or smoke. A solemn, black-haired imbecile of an assistant master, who was later to be a member of Parliament, took the older boys to a secluded room and delivered a talk on the temple of the body. "Don't you realize what a wonderful thing your body is?" he said gravely. "You talk of your motorcar engines, your Rolls-Royces and Daimlers and so on. Don't you understand that no engine ever made is fit to be compared with your body? And then you go and wreck it, ruin it, for life." He turned his cavernous black eyes on me and added quite sadly, "And you, whom I'd always believed to be quite a decent person after your fashion, you, I hear, are one of the very worst." A feeling of doom descended upon me. So I was guilty too. I too had done the dreadful thing, whatever it was, that wrecked you for life, body and soul, and ended in suicide or the lunatic asylum. Till then I had hoped that I was innocent, and the conviction of sin which now took possession of me was perhaps all the stronger because I did not know what I had done. I was not among those who were interrogated and flogged, and it was not until the row was well over that I even learned about the trivial accident that had connected my name with it. Even then I understood nothing. It was not till about 2 years later that I fully grasped what that lecture on the temple of the body had referred to. At this time I was in an almost sexless state, which is normal, or at any rate common, in boys of that age. I was therefore in the position of simultaneously knowing and not knowing what used to be called the facts of life. At 5 or 6, like many children, I had passed through a phase of sexuality. My friends were the plumber's children up the road, and we used sometimes to play games of a vaguely erotic kind. One was called playing at doctors, and I remember getting a faint but definitely pleasant thrill from holding a toy trumpet, which was supposed to be a stethoscope, against a little girl's belly. About the same time I fell deeply in love, a far more worshipping kind of love than I have ever felt for anyone since, with a girl named Elsie at the convent school which I attended. She seemed to me grown up. So I suppose she must have been 15. After that, as so often happens, all sexual feelings seemed to go out of me for many years. At 12 I knew more than I had known as a young child, but I understood less, because I no longer knew the essential fact that there is something pleasant in sexual activity. Between roughly 7 and 14, the whole subject seemed to me uninteresting and, when for some reason I was forced to think of it, disgusting. My knowledge of the so-called facts of life was derived from animals, and was therefore distorted, and in any case was only intermittent. I knew that animals copulated and that human beings had bodies resembling those of animals, but that human beings also copulated I only knew as it were, reluctantly, when something, a phrase in the Bible, perhaps, compelled me to remember it. Not having desire, I had no curiosity, and was willing to leave many questions unanswered. Thus, I knew in principle how the baby gets into the woman. But I did not know how it gets out again, because I had never followed the subject up. I knew all the dirty words, and in my bad moments I would repeat them to myself, but I did not know what the worst of them meant, nor want to know. They were abstractly wicked. A sort of verbal charm. While I remained in this state, it was easy for me to remain ignorant of any sexual misdeeds that went on about me, and to be hardly wiser even when the row broke. At most, through the veiled and terrible warnings of Flip, Sambo and all the rest of them, I grasped that the crime of which we were all guilty was somehow connected with the sexual organs. I had noticed, without feeling much interest, that one's penis sometimes stands up of its own accord. This starts happening to a boy long before he has any conscious sexual desires, and I was inclined to believe, or half believe, that that must be the crime. At any rate, it was something to do with the penis, so much I understood. Many other boys, I have no doubt, were equally in the dark. After the talk on the temple of the body, days later, it seems in retrospect, the row seemed to continue for days. A dozen of us were seated at a long shiny table which Sambo used for the scholarship class, under Flip's lowering eye. A long desolate wail rang out from a room somewhere above. A very small boy named Ronalds, aged no more than about 10, who was implicated in some way, was being flogged, or was recovering from a flogging. At the sound, Flip's eyes searched our faces, and settled upon me. "You see," she said. I will not swear that she said "you see what you have done," but that was the sense of it. We were all bowed down with shame. It was our fault. Somehow or other we had led poor Ronalds astray. We were responsible for his agony and his ruin. Then Flip turned upon another boy named Heath. It is 30 years ago, and I cannot remember for certain whether she merely quoted a verse from the Bible, or whether she actually brought out a Bible and made Heath read it, but at any rate the text indicated was, "Whoso shall offend one of these little ones that believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea." That, too, was terrible. Ronalds was one of these little ones. We had offended him. It were better that millstone were hanged about our necks and that we were drowned in the depth of the sea. "Have you thought about that, Heath? Have you thought what it means?" Flip said. And Heath broke down into snivelling tears. Another boy, Beecham, whom I have mentioned already, was similarly overwhelmed with shame by the accusation that he had black rings round his eyes. "Have you looked in the glass lately, Beecham?" said Flip. "Aren't you ashamed to go about with a face like that? Do you think everyone doesn't know what it means when a boy has black rings round his eyes?" Once again the load of guilt and fear seemed to settle down upon me. Had I got black rings round my eyes? A couple of years later I realized that these were supposed to be a symptom by which masturbators could be detected. But already, without knowing this, I accepted the black rings as a sure sign of depravity, some kind of depravity. And many times, even before I grasped the supposed meaning, I have gazed anxiously into the glass, looking for the first hint of that dreaded stigma, the confession which the secret sinner writes upon his own face. These terrors wore off, or became merely intermittent, without affecting what one might call my official beliefs. It was still true about the madhouse and the suicide's grave, but it was no longer acutely frightening. Some months later it happened that I once again saw Horn, the ringleader who had been flogged and expelled. Horn was one of the outcasts, the son of poor middle-class parents, which was no doubt part of the reason why Sambo had handled him so roughly. The term after his expulsion he went on to Eastbourne College, the small local public school, which was hideously despised at St. Cyprian's and looked on as not really a public school at all. Only a very few boys from St. Cyprian's went there, and Sambo always spoke of them with a sort of contemptuous pity. You had no chance if you went to a school like that. At the best your destiny would be a clerkship. I thought of Horn as a person who at 13 had already forfeited all hope of any decent future. Physically, morally and socially he was finished. Moreover, I assumed that his parents had only sent him to Eastbourne College because after his disgrace no good school would have him. During the following term, when we were out for a walk, we passed Horn in the street. He looked completely normal. He was a strongly built, rather good-looking boy with black hair. I immediately noticed that he looked better than when I had last seen him. His complexion, previously rather pale, was pinker, and that he did not seem embarrassed at meeting us. Apparently he was not ashamed either of having been expelled, or of being at Eastbourne College. If one could gather anything from the way he looked at us as we filed past, it was that he was glad to have escaped from St. Cyprian's. But the encounter made very little impression on me. I drew no inference from the fact that Horn, ruined in body and soul, appeared to be happy and in good health. I still believed in the sexual mythology that had been taught me by Sambo and Flip. The mysterious, terrible dangers were still there. Any morning the black rings might appear round your eyes and you would know that you too were among the lost ones. Only it no longer seemed to matter very much. These contradictions can exist easily in the mind of a child, because of its own vitality. It accepts, how can it do otherwise? The nonsense that its elders tell it, but its youthful body, and the sweetness of the physical world, tell it another story. It was the same with hell, which up to the age of about 14 I officially believed in. Almost certainly hell existed, and there were occasions when a vivid sermon could scare you into fits. But somehow it never lasted. The fire that waited for you was real fire. It would hurt in the same way as when you burnt your finger, and forever, but most of the time you could contemplate it without bothering. Section 5. The various codes which were presented to you at St. Cyprian's, religious, moral, social and intellectual, contradicted one another if you worked out their implications. The essential conflict was between the tradition of 19th-century asceticism and the actually existing luxury and snobbery of the pre-1914 age. On the one side were low church Bible Christianity, sex Puritanism, insistence on hard work, respect for academic distinction, disapproval of self-indulgence. On the other, contempt for braininess, and worship of games, contempt for foreigners and the working class, an almost neurotic dread of poverty, and, above all, the assumption not only that money and privilege are the things that matter, but that it is better to inherit them than to have to work for them. Broadly, you were bidden to be at once a Christian and a social success, which is impossible. At the time I did not perceive that the various ideals which were set before us cancelled out. I merely saw that they were all, or nearly all, unattainable, so far as I was concerned, since they all depended not only on what you did but on what you were. Very early, at the age of only 10 or 11, I reached the conclusion, no one told me this, but on the other hand I did not simply make it up out of my own head, somehow it was in the air I breathed, that you were no good unless you had £100,000. I had perhaps fixed on this particular sum as a result of reading Thackeray. The interest on £100,000 would be £4,000 a year. I was in favour of a safe 4%, and this seemed to me the minimum income that you must possess if you were to belong to the real top crust, the people in the country houses. But it was clear that I could never find my way into that paradise, to which you did not really belong unless you were born into it. You could only make money, if at all, by a mysterious operation called going to the city. And when you came out of the city, having won you £100,000, you were fat and old. But the truly enviable thing about the top-notchers was that they were rich while young. For people like me, the ambitious middle class, the examination passers, only a bleak, laborious kind of success was possible. You clambered upwards on a ladder of scholarships into the civil service or the Indian civil service, or possibly you became a barrister. And if at any point you slacked or went off and missed one of the rungs in the ladder, you became a little office boy at £40 a year. But even if you climbed to the highest niche that was open to you, you could still only be an underling, a hanger-on of the people who really counted. Even if I had not learned this from Sambo and Flip, I would have learned it from other boys. Looking back, it is astonishing how intimately, intelligently snobbish we all were, how knowledgeable about names and addresses, how swift to detect small differences in accents and manners and the cut of clothes. There were some boys who seemed to drip money from their paws even in the bleak misery of the middle of a winter term. At the beginning and end of the term, especially, there was narvely snobbish chatter about Switzerland, and Scotland with its gillies and grouse moors, and my uncle's yacht, and our place in the country, and my pony and my pater's touring car. There never was, I suppose, in the history of the world a time when the sheer vulgar fatness of wealth, without any kind of aristocratic elegance to redeem it, was so obtrusive as in those years before 1914. It was the age when crazy millionaires in curly top hats and lavender waistcoats gave champagne parties in rococo houseboats on the Thames, the age of Diablo and hobble skirts, the age of the Canute in his grey bowler and cutaway coat, the age of the Merry Widow, Sucky's novels, Peter Pan and Where the Rainbow Ends. The age when people talked about chocks and cigs and ripping and topping and heavenly, when they went for divvy weekends at Brighton and had scrumptious teas at the Troc. From the whole decade before 1914 there seems to breathe forth a smell of the more vulgar, ungrown-up kind of luxury, a smell of brilliantine and creme de menthe and soft-scented chocolates, an atmosphere, as it were, of eating everlasting strawberry ices on green lawns to the tune of the Eton boating song. The extraordinary thing was the way in which everyone took it for granted that his oozing, bulging wealth of the English upper and upper middle classes would last forever, and was part of the order of things. After 1918 it was never quite the same again. Snobbishness and expensive habits came back, certainly. But they were self-conscious and on the defensive. Before the war the worship of money was entirely unreflecting and untroubled by any pang of conscience. The goodness of money was as unmistakable as the goodness of health or beauty, and a glittering car, a title or a horde of servants was mixed up in people's minds with the idea of actual moral virtue. At St. Cyprian's, in term time, the general bareness of life enforced a certain democracy, but any mention of the holidays, and the consequent competitive swanking about cars and butlers and country housed, promptly called class distinctions into being. The school was pervaded by a curious cult of Scotland, which brought out the fundamental contradiction in our standard of values. Flip claimed Scottish ancestry, and she favoured the Scottish boys, encouraging them to wear kilts in their ancestral tartan instead of the school uniform, and even christened her youngest child by a Gaelic name. Ostensibly we were supposed to admire the Scots because they were grim and dour, stern was perhaps the key word, and irresistible on the field of battle. In the big schoolroom there was a steel engraving of the charge to the Scots Greys at Waterloo, all looking as though they enjoyed every moment of it. Our picture of Scotland was made up of burns, brays, kilts, sporrans, claymores, bagpipes and the like, all somehow mixed up with the invigorating effects of porridge, Protestantism and a cold climate. But underlying this was something quite different. The real reason for the cult of Scotland was that only very rich people could spend their summers there. And the pretended belief in Scottish superiority was a cover for the bad conscience of the occupying English, who had pushed the Highland peasantry off their farms to make way for the deer forests, and then compensated them by turning them into servants. Flip's face always beamed with innocent snobbishness when she spoke of Scotland. Occasionally she even attempted a trace of Scottish accent. Scotland was a private paradise which a few initiates could talk about and make outsiders feel small. You going to Scotland this Halls? Rather. We go every year. My pater's got 3 miles of river. My pater's giving me a new gun for the 12th. There's jolly good black game where we go. Get out, Smith. What are listening for? You've never been to Scotland. I bet you don't know what a blackcock looks like. Following on this, imitations of the cry of a blackcock, of the roaring of a stag, of the accent of our gillies, etc. etc. And the questionings that new boys of doubtful social origin were sometimes put through, questionings quite surprising in their mean-minded particularity, when one reflects that the inquisitors were only 12 or 13. How much a year has your pater got? What part of London do you live in? Is that Knightsbridge or Kensington? How many bathrooms has your house got? How many servants do your people keep? Have you got a butler? Well, then, have you got a cook? Where do you get your clothes made? How many shows did you go to in the halls? How much money did you bring back with you? Etc. etc. I have seen a little new boy, hardly older than 8, desperately lying his way through such a catechism. Have your people got a car? Yes. What sort of car? Daimler. How many horsepower? Pause, and leap in the dark, 15. What kind of lights? The little boy is bewildered. What kind of lights? Electric or acetylene? A longer pause, and another leap in the dark, acetylene. Coo. He says his pater's car's got acetylene lamps. They went out years ago. It must be as old as the hill. Rot. He's making it up. He hasn't got a car. He's just a navvy. Your pater's a navvy. And so on. By the social standards that prevailed about me, I was no good, and could not be any good. But all the different kinds of virtue seemed to be mysteriously interconnected and to belong to much the same people. It was not only money that mattered. There were also strength, beauty, charm, athleticism and something called guts or character, which in reality meant the power to impose your will on others. I did not possess any of these qualities. At games, for instance, I was hopeless. I was a fairly good swimmer and not altogether contemptible at cricket, but these had no prestige value, because boys only attach importance to a game if it requires strength and courage. What counted was football, at which I was a funk. I loathed the game, and since I could see no pleasure or usefulness in it, it was very difficult for me to show courage at it. Football, it seemed to me, is not really played for the pleasure of kicking a ball about, but is a species of fighting. The lovers of football are large, boisterous, knobbly boys who are good at knocking down and trampling on slightly smaller boys. That was the pattern of school life, a continuous triumph of the strong over the weak. Virtue consisted in winning, it consisted in being bigger, stronger, handsome, richer, more popular, more elegant, more unscrupulous than other people, in dominating them. Bullying them, making them suffer pain, making them look foolish, getting the better of them in every way. Life was hierarchical and whatever happened was right. There were the strong, who deserved to win and always did win, and there were the weak, who deserved to lose and always did lose, everlastingly. I did not question the prevailing standards, because so far as I could see there were no others. How could the rich, the strong, the elegant, the fashionable, the powerful, be in the wrong? It was their world, and the rules they made for it must be the right ones. And yet from a very early age I was aware of the impossibility of any subjective conformity. Always at the center of my heart the inner self seemed to be awake, pointing out the difference between the moral obligation and the psychological fact. It was the same in all matters, worldly or otherworldly. Take religion, for instance. You were supposed to love God, and I did not question this. Till the age of about 14 I believed in God, and believed that the accounts given of him were true. But I was well aware that I did not love him. On the contrary, I hated him, just as I hated Jesus and the Hebrew patriarchs. If I had sympathetic feelings towards any character in the Old Testament, it was towards such people as Cain, Jezebel, Haman, Agag, Sisera. In the New Testament my friends, if any, were Ananias, Caiaphas, Judas, and Pontius Pilate. But the whole business of religion seemed to be strewn with psychological impossibilities. The prayer book told you, for example, to love God and fear Him, but how could you love someone whom you feared? With your private affections it was the same. What you ought to feel was usually clear enough, but the appropriate emotion could not be commanded. Obviously it was my duty to feel grateful towards Flip and Sambo. But I was not grateful. It was equally clear that one ought to love one's father, but I knew very well that I merely disliked my own father, whom I had barely seen before I was 8 and who appeared to me simply as a gruff-voiced elderly man forever saying don't. It was not that one did not want to possess the right qualities or feel the correct emotions, but that one could not. The good and the possible never seemed to coincide. There was a line of verse that I came across not actually while I was at St. Cyprian's, but a year or two later, and which seemed to strike a sort of leaden echo in my heart. It was, "The armies of unalterable law." I understood to perfection what it meant to be Lucifer, defeated and justly defeated, with no possibility of revenge. The schoolmasters with their canes, the millionaires with their Scottish castles, the athletes with their curly hair, these were the armies of unalterable law. It was not easy, at that date, to realize that in fact it was alterable. And according to that law I was damned. I had no money, I was weak, I was ugly, I was unpopular, I had a chronic cough. I was cowardly, I smelt. This picture, I should add, was not altogether fanciful. I was an unattractive boy. St. Cyprian's soon made me so, even if I had not been so before. But a child's belief in its own shortcomings is not much influenced by facts. I believed, for example, that I smelt. But this was based simply on general probability. It was notorious that disagreeable people smelt, and therefore presumably I did so too. Again, until after I had left school for good I continued to believe that I was preternaturally ugly. It was what my schoolfellows had told me, and I had no other authority to refer to. The conviction that it was not possible for me to be a success went deep enough to influence my actions till far into adult life. Until I was about 30 I always planned my life on the assumption not only that any major undertaking was bound to fail, but that I could only expect to live a few years longer. But this sense of guilt and inevitable failure was balanced by something else, that is, the instinct to survive. Even a creature that is weak, ugly, cowardly, smelly and in no way justifiable still wants to stay alive and be happy after its own fashion. I could not invert the existing scale of values, or turn myself into a success. But I could accept my failure and make the best of it. I could resign myself to being what I was, and then endeavor to survive on those terms. To survive, or at least to preserve any kind of independence, was essentially criminal, since it meant breaking rules which you yourself recognized. There was a boy named Johnny Hale who for some months oppressed me horribly. He was a big, powerful, coarsely handsome boy with a very red face and curly black hair, who was forever twisting somebody's arm, wringing somebody's ear, flogging somebody with a riding crop. He was a member of the sixth form, or performing prodigies of activity on the football field. Flip loved him, hence the fact he was habitually called by his Christian name, and Sambo commended him as a boy who had character and could keep order. He was followed about by a group of toadies who nicknamed him Strong Man. One day, when we were taking off our overcoats in the changing room, Hale picked on me for some reason. I answered him back. Whereupon he gripped my wrist, twisted it round and bent my forearm back upon itself in a hideously painful way. I remember his handsome, jeering red face bearing down upon mine. He was, I think, older than I, besides being enormously stronger. As he let go of me a terrible, wicked resolve formed itself in my heart. I would get back on him by hitting him when he did not expect it. It was a strategic moment, for the master who had been taking the walk would be coming back almost immediately, and then there could be no fight. I let perhaps a minute go by, walked up to Hale with the most harmless air I could assume, and then, getting the weight of my body behind it, smashed my fist into his face. He was flung backwards by the blow, and some blood ran out of his mouth. His always sanguine face turned almost black with rage. Then he turned away to rinse his mouth at the wash basins. "All right," he said to me between his teeth as the master led us away. For days after this he followed me about, challenging me to fight. Although terrified out of my wits, I steadily refused to fight. I said that the blow in the face had served him right, and there was an end of it. Curiously enough, he did not simply fall upon me there and then, which public opinion would probably have supported him in doing. So gradually the matter tailed off, and there was no fight. Now, I had behaved wrongly, by my own code no less than his. To hit him unawares was wrong. But to refuse afterwards to fight knowing that if we fought we would beat me, that was far worse. It was cowardly. If I had refused because I disapproved of fighting, or because I genuinely felt the matter to be closed, it would have been all right, but I had refused merely because I was afraid. Even my revenge was made empty by that fact. I had struck the blow in a moment of mindless violence, deliberately not looking far ahead and merely determined to get my own back for once and damn the consequences. I had had time to realize that what I did was wrong, but it was the kind of crime from which you could get some satisfaction. Now all was nullified. There had been a sort of courage in the first act, but my subsequent cowardice had wiped it out. The fact I hardly noticed was that though Hale formally challenged me to fight, he did not actually attack me. Indeed, after receiving that one blow he never oppressed me again. It was perhaps 20 years before I saw the significance of this. At the time I could not see beyond the moral dilemma that is presented to the weak in a world governed by the strong: break the rules, or perish. I did not see that in that case the weak have the right to make a different set of rules for themselves. Because, even if such an idea had occurred to me, there was no one in my environment who could have confirmed me in it. I lived in a world of boys, gregarious animals questioning nothing, accepting the law of the stronger and avenging their own humiliations by passing them down to someone smaller. My situation was that of countless other boys, and if potentially I was more of a rebel than most, it was only because, by boyish standards, I was a poorer specimen. But I never did rebel intellectually, only emotionally. I had nothing to help me except my dumb selfishness, my inability, not, indeed, to despise myself, but to dislike myself, my instinct to survive. It was about a year after I hit Johnny Hale in the face that I left St. Cyprian's forever. It was the end of a winter term. With a sense of coming out from darkness into sunlight, I put on my old boy's tie as we dressed for the journey. I well remember the feeling of emancipation, as though the tie had been at once a badge of manhood and an amulet against Flip's voice and Sambo's cane. I was escaping from bondage. It was not that I expected, or even intended, to be any more successful at a public school than I had been at St. Cyprian's. But still, I was escaping. I knew that at a public school there would be more privacy, more neglect, more chance to be idle and self-indulgent and degenerate. For years I had been resolved, unconsciously at first, but consciously later on, that when once my scholarship was won I would slack off and cram no longer. This resolve, by the way, was so fully carried out that between the ages of 13 and 22 or 3 I hardly ever did a stroke of avoidable work. Flip shook hands to say goodbye. She even gave me my Christian name for the occasion. But there was a sort of patronage, almost a sneer, in her face and in her voice. The tone in which she said goodbye was nearly the tone in which she had been used to say little butterflies. I had won 2 scholarships, but I was a failure, because success was measured not by what you did but by what you were. I was not a good type of boy and could bring no credit on the school. I did not possess character or courage or health or strength or money, or even good manners, the power to look like a gentleman. Goodbye. Flip's parting smile seemed to say, it's not worth quarreling now. You haven't made much of a success of your time at St. Cyprian's, have you? And I don't suppose you'll get on awfully well at a public school either. We make a mistake, really, in wasting our time and money on you. This kind of education hasn't much to offer to a boy with your background and your outlook. Oh, don't think we don't understand you. We know all about those ideas you have at the back of your head. We know you disbelieve in everything we've taught you, and we know you aren't in the least grateful for all we've done for you. but there's no use in bringing it all up now. We aren't responsible for you any longer, and we shan't be seeing you again. Let's just admit that you're one of our failures and part without ill feeling. And so, goodbye." That at least was what I read into her face. And yet how happy I was, that winter morning, as the train bore me away with the gleaming new silk tie, dark green, pale blue and black, if I remember rightly, round my neck. The world was opening before me, just a little, like a grey sky which exhibits a narrow crack of blue. A public school would be better fun than St. Cyprian's, but at bottom equally alien. In a world where the prime necessities were money, titled relatives, athleticism, tailor-made clothes, neatly brushed hair, a charming smile, I was no good. All I had gained was a breathing space. A little quietude, a little self-indulgence, a little respite from cramming, and then, ruin. What kind of ruin I did not know, perhaps the colonies or an office stool, perhaps prison or an early death. But first a year or two in which one could slack off and get the benefit of one's sins, like Dr. Faustus. I believed firmly in my evil destiny, and yet I was acutely happy. It is the advantage of being 13 that you can not only live in the moment, but do so with full consciousness, foreseeing the future and yet not caring about it. Next term I was going to Wellington. I had also won a scholarship at Eton, but it was uncertain whether there would be a vacancy, and I was going to Wellington first. At Eton you had a room to yourself, a room which might even have a fire in it. At Wellington you had your own cubicle, and could make yourself cocoa in the evenings. The privacy of it, the grown-upness. And there would be libraries to hang about in, and summer afternoons when you could shirk games and mooch about the countryside alone, with no master driving you along. Meanwhile there were the holidays. There was the .22 rifle that I had bought the previous holidays, the crack shot, it was called, costing 22 and sixpence, and Christmas was coming next week. There were also the pleasures of overeating. I thought of some particularly voluptuous cream buns which could be bought for twopence each at a shop in our town. This was 1916, and food rationing had not yet started. Even the detail that my journey money had been slightly miscalculated, leaving about a shilling over, enough for an unforeseen cup of coffee and a cake or two somewhere on the way, was enough to fill me with bliss. There was time for a bit of happiness before the future closed in upon me. But I did know that the future was dark. Failure, 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 failure behind me, failure ahead of me, that was by far the deepest conviction that I carried away. Section 6. All this was 30 years ago and more. The question is, does a child at school go through the same kind of experiences nowadays? The only honest answer, I believe, is that we do not with certainty know. Of course it is obvious that the present-day attitude towards education is enormously more humane and sensible than that of the past. The snobbishness that was an integral part of my own education would be almost unthinkable today, because the society that nourished it is dead. I recall a conversation that must have taken place about a year before I left St. Cyprian's. A Russian boy, large and fair-haired, a year older than myself, was questioning me. "How much a year has your father got?" I told him what I thought it was, adding a few hundreds to make it sound better. The Russian boy, neat in his habits, produced a pencil and a small notebook and made a calculation. "My father has over 200 times as much money as yours," he announced with a sort of amused contempt. That was in 1915. What happened to that money a couple of years later, I wonder? And still more I wonder, do conversations of that kind happen at preparatory schools now? Clearly there has been a vast change of outlook, a general growth of enlightenment, even among ordinary, unthinking middle-class people. Religious belief, for instance, has largely vanished, dragging other kinds of nonsense after it. I imagine that very few people nowadays would tell a child that if it masturbates it will end in the lunatic asylum. Beating, too, has become discredited, and has even been abandoned at many schools. Nor is the underfeeding of children looked on as a normal, almost meritorious act. No one now would openly set out to give his pupils as little food as they could do with, or tell them that it is healthy to get up from a meal as hungry as you sat down. The whole status of children has improved, partly because they have grown relatively less numerous. And the diffusion of even a little psychological knowledge has made it harder for parents and school teachers to indulge their aberrations in the name of discipline. Here is a case, not known to me personally, but known to someone I can vouch for, and happening within my own lifetime. A small girl, daughter of a clergyman, continued wetting her bed at an age when she should have grown out of it. In order to punish her for this dreadful deed, her father took her to a large garden party, and there introduced her to the whole company as a little girl who wetted her bed, and to underline her wickedness he had previously painted her face black. I do not suggest that Flip and Sambo would actually have done a thing like this, but I doubt whether it would have much surprised them. After all, things do change. And yet the question is not whether boys are still buckled into Eton collars on Sunday, or told that babies are dug up under gooseberry bushes. That kind of thing is at an end, admittedly. The real question is whether it is still normal for a school child to live for years amid irrational terrors and lunatic misunderstandings. And here one is up against the very great difficulty of knowing what a child really feels and thinks. A child which appears reasonably happy may actually be suffering horrors which it cannot or will not reveal. It lives in a sort of alien underwater world which we can only penetrate by memory or divination. Our chief clue is the fact that we were once children ourselves, and many people appear to forget the atmosphere of their own childhood almost entirely. Think for instance of the unnecessary torments that people will inflict by sending a child back to school with clothes to the wrong pattern, and refusing to see that this matters. Over things of this kind the child will sometimes utter a protest, but a great deal of the time its attitude is one of simple concealment. Not to expose your true feelings to an adult seems to be instinctive from the age of 7 or 8 onwards. Even the affection that one feels for a child, the desire to protect and cherish it, is a cause of misunderstanding. One can love a child, perhaps, more deeply than one can love another adult, but it is rash to assume that the child feels any love in return. Looking back on my own childhood, after the infant years were over, I do not believe that I ever felt love for any mature person, except my mother, and even her I did not trust, in the sense that shyness made me conceal most of my real feelings from her. Love, the spontaneous, unqualified emotion of love, was something I could only feel for people who were young. Towards people who were old, and remember that old to a child means over 30, or even over 25, I could feel reverence, respect, admiration or compunction, but I seemed cut off from them by a veil of fear and shyness mixed up with physical distaste. People are too ready to forget the child's physical shrinking from the adult. The enormous size of grown-ups, their ungainly, rigid bodies, their coarse, wrinkled skins, their great relaxed eyelids, their yellow teeth, and the whiffs of musty clothes and beer and sweat and tobacco that disengage from them at every movement. Part of the reason for the ugliness of adults, in a child's eyes, is that the child is usually looking upwards, and few faces are at their best when seen from below. Besides, being fresh and unmarked itself, the child has impossibly high standards in the matter of skin and teeth and complexion. But the greatest barrier of all is the child's misconception about age. A child can hardly envisage life beyond 30, and in judging people's ages it will make fantastic mistakes. It will think that a person of 25 is 40, that a person of 40 is 65, and so on. Thus, when I fell in love with Elsie I took her to be grown up. I met her again, when I was 13 and she, I think, must have been 23, she now seemed to me a middle-aged woman, somewhat past her best. And the child thinks of growing old as an almost obscene calamity, which for some mysterious reason will never happen to itself. All who have passed the age of 30 are joyless grotesques, endlessly fussing about things of no importance and staying alive without, so far as the child can see, having anything to live for. Only child life is real life. The schoolmaster who imagines that he is loved and trusted by his boys is in fact mimicked and laughed at behind his back. An adult who does not seem dangerous nearly always seems ridiculous. I base these generalizations on what I can recall of my own childhood outlook. Treacherous though memory is, it seems to me the chief means we have of discovering how a child's mind works. Only by resurrecting our own memories can we realize how incredibly distorted is the child's vision of the world. Consider this, for example. How would Saint Cyprian's appear to me now, if I could go back, at my present age, and see it as it was in 1915? What should I think of Sambo and Flip, those terrible, all-powerful monsters? I should see them as a couple of silly, shallow, ineffectual people, eagerly clambering up a social ladder which any thinking person could see to be on the point of collapse. I would no more be frightened of them than I would be frightened of a dormouse. Moreover, in those days they seemed to me fantastically old, whereas, though of this I am not certain, I imagine they must have been somewhat younger than I am now. And how would Johnny Hale appear with his blacksmith's arms and his red, jeering face? Merely a scruffy little boy, barely distinguishable from hundreds of other scruffy little boys. The two sets of facts can lie side by side in my mind, because those happen to be my own memories. But it would be very difficult for me to see with the eyes of any other child, except by an effort of the imagination which might lead me completely astray. The child and the adult live in different worlds. If that is so, we cannot be certain that school, at any rate boarding school, is not still for many children as dreadful an experience as it used to be. Take away God, Latin, the game, class distinctions and sexual taboos, and the fear, the hatred, the snobbery and the misunderstanding might still all be there. It will have been seen that my own main trouble was an utter lack of any sense of proportion or probability. This led me to accept outrages and believe absurdities, and to suffer torments over things which were in fact of no importance. It is not enough to say that I was silly and ought to have known better. Look back into your own childhood and think of the nonsense you used to believe and the trivialities which could make you suffer. Of course my own case had its individual variations, but essentially it was that of countless other boys. The weakness of the child is that it starts with a blank sheet. It neither understands nor questions the society in which it lives, and because of its credulity other people can work upon it, infecting it with the sense of inferiority and the dread of offending against mysterious, terrible laws. It may be that everything that happened to me at St. Cyprian's could happen in the most enlightened school, though perhaps in subtler forms. Of one thing, however, I do feel fairly sure, and that is that boarding schools are worse than day schools. A child has a better chance with the sanctuary of its home near at hand. And I think the characteristic faults of the English upper and middle classes may be partly due to the practice, general until recently, of sending children away from home as young as 9, 8 or even 7. I have never been back to St. Cyprian's. Reunions, old boys' dinners and such like leave me something more than cold, even when my memories are friendly. I have never even been down to Eton, where I was relatively happy, though I did once pass through it in 1933 and noted with interest that nothing seemed to have changed, except that the shops now sold radios. As for St. Cyprian's, for years I loathed its very name so deeply that I could not view it with enough detachment to see the significance of the things that happened to me there. In a way it is only within the last decade that I have really thought over my school days. Vividly though their memory has always haunted me. Nowadays, I believe, it would make very little impression on me to see the place again, if it still exists. I remember hearing a rumor some years ago that it had been burnt down. If I had to pass through Eastbourne I would not make a detour to avoid the school, and if I happened to pass the school itself I might even stop for a moment by the low brick wall, with the steep bank running down from it, and look across the flat playing field at the ugly building with the square of asphalt in front of it. And if I went inside and smelt again the inky, dusty smell of the big schoolroom, the rosiny smell of the chapel, the stagnant smell of the swimming bath and the cold reek of the lavatories, I think I should only feel what one invariably feels in revisiting any scene of childhood, how small everything has grown, and how terrible is the deterioration in myself. But it is a fact that for many years I could hardly have borne to look at it again. Except upon dire necessity I would not have set foot in Eastbourne. I even conceived a prejudice against Sussex, as the country that contained St. Cyprian's, and as an adult I have only once been in Sussex, on a short visit. Now, however, the place is out of my system for good. Its magic works no longer, and I have not even enough animosity left to make me hope that Flip and Sambo are dead or that the story of the school being burnt down was true. End of the essay. Thank you. Thank you.